Welcome, everybody, to the seventh episode of Stories from the Last Territory, podcast that will cover the golden years of wrestling in Puerto Rico. My name is Luis Cuevas, better known as the Caveman, and I am your host for this trip back in time to the greatest feuds in the history of Puerto Rico. If you like what you hear and see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or in audio at Spotify as Stories from the Last Territory. Today, we're going to be taking a little detour related to covering the feuds, the storylines of the glory years to talk about some of the most important tag teams that came to the island during the glory years. Of course, it will be impossible to cover all of them. So maybe we can do a two-part. Today, we're going to try to do my best to cover some of the most famous ones. And then in another occasion, we're going to be talking about some of the more secondary tag teams that came to the island during the glory years of wrestling in Puerto Rico. We're going to start with some of the tag teams that came into the 70s, and we're going to finish with some of the ones that came through the 80s. How about that? So the first one that we're going to talk about is the Martel brothers, or the mercenaries. Pierre, Daniel, and Michel Martel were possibly the first big rule breaker tag team that took the island by storm in the late 70s with the gimmick of the loaded boots. They had come from the IWA promotion, and they had very bloody feuds with the likes of the tag teams of Carlos Colon and Jose Rivera, the Medics, the Invaders of the North American titles or the Caribbean titles, or just personal feuds. Most of them were just personal feuds. They came in and they were hated by everybody. Sadly, there's not much in sense of videotape, and sadly, I never, for example, got to see them live as I was like 3 or 4 years when they were running wild on the island. But they left an impression that even to this day, you post something about the Martel brothers, and people talk, "Oh, I remember when this happened. Oh, I remember when that happened." Once Michel Martel died, other Martels that were supposedly brothers, including Rick Martel, came to the island looking for vengeance against Invader One, who allegedly had killed Martel with his hard punch in storyline. And Invader One and Pierre Martel then had one of the most bloodiest feuds in the history of the island. And then they became tag teams, and Pierre Martel became one of the biggest baby faces in the island in the early 80s. That's wrestling for you, right? But the Martel brothers to this day have left an impression almost 50 years later that they were the first tag team that came in and just completely dominated the island in wrestling. The second one, and probably the one that more fame or more legendary status had because of what they accomplished, had to be the Vaqueros del Mal or los Vaqueros Locos or the Crazy Cowboys of Dutch Mantel and Frankie Lane. They came to the island in 1979 with a gimmick that they were offering $1,000 to any team that would defeat them in TV. And while they were doing that, they were talking trash and they were talking real bad about Puerto Rico. Dutch Mantel was throwing a lot of crazy things at that time. And in TV, they will beat every tag team they face, and then they will come and gloat, nobody can defeat us, nobody can claim the $1,000 silver dollars. Into, of course, they were challenged by the then top tag team in the territory, Jose Rivera and Carlos Colon, who in TV finally did the miracle. They defeated them. But before Jose Rivera and Carlos Colon could cash, you know, claimed their prize. They were both attacked by the Vaqueros del Mal. They took out Carlos Colon outside the ring, and they just beat the living hell out of Jose Rivera, hurting him in the process, into almost causing a riot in the studio, into Huracan Castillo, who had been the number one rule breaker in the 70s, couldn't stand the abuse and came to make the save, beating up Dutch Mantel and Frankie Lane, who ran to the dressing room and basically the angle got hot and people wanted to see Dutch Mantel and Frankie Lane get their asses whooped for beating Jose Rivera, who was one of the most popular wrestlers in the island. This led to 9 straight sold-outs of Juan Ramon Lubriel Stadium in 1979. See the combination of Huracan Castillo and Carlos Colon at first, and then when Jose Rivera came back and Carlos Colon exact revenge on the Vaqueros. You imagine that 9 straight sold-outs. That's a streak that I honestly do not think will ever be broken in the island. I mean, that tells you how much heat Dutch Manteo and Frankie Lane had during this run, during this time. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend Storytime with Dutch Manteo, talking about This angle is a fascinating look of how he felt, how he saw that the fans hate was building and building and building, that there were some times that they were like, oh man, they're gonna kill us, and they explained there the reason why always the main event of the cars in Puerto Rico were always held before intermission, because first, people were not as drunk, and second, people will not cause a riot if they had to stay and see 3 or 4 more matches, because if not, it would have been crazy. So the Vaqueros Locos, the Vaqueros del Mal, there are different names for them during this time. Frankie Lane and Dutch Mantel were possibly the most drawing tag team uh, a run that they had in Puerto Rico. 9 straight sellouts. I mean, that's over more than 100,000 people paid to see them uh, get, fight Carlos Colon, Jose Rivera, Carlos Colon, and Huracan Castillo. That is just mind blowing to think about it, especially today when they barely can get 200, 300 people to a car. Another tag team in the 70s that left a big impression were the Funk brothers, Terry and Dory Funk. They were holders of the longest tag team reign of the world titles in the island. They held the tag team titles for 2.5 years, a record that, again, I do not believe will ever be broken in the island. The Funk brothers established the tag team titles and gave them credibility during a time where World Wrestling Council was trying to establish themselves worldwide. And they defended the titles against both rule breakers or fan favorites, against the Briscoes, against the Kangaroos, against the Invaders, against Carlos Colon and Jose Rivera, against everybody that would come to the island, both faces and rule breakers. They will bury the assassins and so and so. But they were great in establishing and giving credibility to the tag team titles, because both of them have been war heavyweight champions of the NWA. So that in itself gave credibility to the tag team titles. So people in Puerto Rico are always thankful to them for doing that for the island. That establishing the World Tag Team titles, and it led to many, many good years, and the titles being recognized as one of the best in the world. The Invader 1 and 2, Jose Gonzalez and Roberto Soto, came to the island under a mask, calling themselves the Invaders, both using the gimmick of the hard punch. And they took the island by storm, becoming one of the most popular and famous tag teams in the island. The Feuds versus the Martel, the Canguros, the Funks, the Vaqueros, the Orient Express of Hendo Kimura and Hendo Sasaki, and many more made them super popular in the island. They became World Tag Team titles in what is considered the best tag team tournament that has ever been held in the island, with some of the best talent from around the world. The funny thing about them is, even when they were successful, both Roberto Soto and Jose Gonzalez did not really get along in real life. Even to this day, um, Roberto Soto felt that Jose Gonzalez held him back in a solo career in Puerto Rico, and that was always trying to get all the glory of the tag team. That's what Roberto Soto has said in some interviews that he has done during the time. And who am I to, you know, go against him? But anyway, the tag team ended when Invader 1 asked his former enemy Pierre Martel, instead of Invader 2, to become his partner in a tag team tournament. And of course, in a rage of jealousy, Invader 2 turned on Invader 1, and they embarked an incredible and bloody feud that ended with a loser leaves town, where Invader 2 left, and I think he went to Continental Wrestling after that. In the mid 80s, Roberto Soto, Invader 2, will come to the island, and he would do tag team with the Invader, but he would just come for a little time, 2 months here, 1 month here, especially when the rule breakers were hurt. Invader 3 or Invader 2 will come in to tag team with Jose Gonzalez to fight over whoever had hurt Invader 3 during this time. To this day, uh, there's a debate of which Invader tag team was the better one. If this version of the tag team, or the 83 to 89 version with Johnny Rivera that we're going to be talking in a couple of few minutes. Uh, Something that will be good. They became full tag team partners again in 1997, and again Invader 2 betrayed Jose Gonzalez in a match in anniversary 97. So then they redo the whole feud all over again, and it wasn't as successful as the first one, but it still did good business. A tag team that became really, really popular during this time of the 80s, the glory years, and for some reason, to this day, I still don't get it. Maybe it's because I saw them before in Jim Crockett and I saw them in World Class and the Rock and Roll RPMs, Mike Davis and Tommy Lane. Yes, believe it or not, between 1986 and 1987, few tag teams were as popular or as over as the tag team of the RPMs in the island. For some reason, people took to them. And even to this day, they are super loved in the island. You know, they were winners of the World Tag Team titles, North American title. They won every tag team titles in the island. It has some great feuds, especially against Cheeky and Ron Starr. There's a famous angle where they were doing a Mike Davis appreciation, and Mike Davis had his family, his daughters in the ring, and they were giving him gifts by the fans and stuff like that. And Cheeky and Ron Starr came, and they're like, "Hey, we come here in peace. We just want you to have a gift from our part." And they took out this big portrait of the RPMs, and they were trying to peep, and people are, that's nice. And then before you know it, they broke it over Mike Davis' head, leaving him bloody, and they show the stitches and everything. I highly recommend you checking out this angle. It's in YouTube. The Stars Attack, the RPMs, I think is what it's called, and that made the feud even more personal, and they battle over the island. For the World Tag Team titles. They also had a great feud versus Crutcher and Eric Embry that involved Wendy Richter, who at that time was Hugo Sabinovich's wife, and it was the RPMs and Wendy Richter against Crutcher and Eric Embry, and Sacha was the valet of Eric Embry, and of course Chicken Run Star and Peaches. So they did a lot of things with Wendy Richter during that time, and against also them, they also had a great feud against the Chip Herders, and that made them one of the most beloved tag teams in the island. Something that to this day I'm still surprised it happened because I just never saw it. Them and the Batten twins being popular in Puerto Rico is something that I can never get over it. Even to this day, every time I talk about the RPMs and I say something bad about them, people will write me, "Why are you talking bad about them? They were great." And I'm going, "No, they weren't." But okay, but in Puerto Rico, they were. It's just one of those things that blow my mind and still can get over it. Let it go, Luis. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Anyway, the other tag team were Chiqui and Runstar, Los Primos. Between 1986 and 1988, this tag team wreaked havoc over the tag team scene in the island alongside on Runstar's wife Peaches. They had feuds against the likes of the Invaders, the RPMs, the John Bloods, the Caribbean Express of Huracan Castillo and Milito Perez, the Batten brothers over both the World and the North American titles. To this day, one of the biggest what the F moment in the island is when Capital, for some reason, decide to split them and have a feud between them that nobody wanted to see. That made no sense, and that really was not a good feud because people were like, "Why are you having them fight?" Primos were awesome. They still had like miles and miles and miles together as a tag team. That's how good they were as the main rule breaker tag team during this time, where they were just talk and that whole thing about, "Oh, he's my cousin," and this and that. People were pissed about that because you really are not cousins, but for some reason it did work. And I know that in an 88 they had to try throw everything against the sink because of the bloody thing, but that was one of those like, why are they doing this? And it didn't work. The split of them as a tag team, and they still remember to this day as one of the greatest tag teams to ever lace put in the island. The tag team of the Super Medics, the tag team of Johnny Ross and Jose Estrada in late 83 and 84, alongside Johnny Oates and later Don Kent, I believe. Under under the mask, they brought the fabulous Freebirds gimmick, they brought the Killer Bees, Switcheroo gimmick, and they became one of the most dominant tag teams of the early 80s, winning all the tag team titles available in the island and having feuds with all the greatest tag teams in 83. We're talking about the Gilberts, Quintonga and Apollo. We're talking about Carlos Colon and Invader One, the Invaders. Any tag teams during that time, they will fight the Super Medics. They are credited with changing the way tag team wrestling was done in Puerto Rico. They modernized it. They did. I know it sounds strange because many people have the perception of Johnny Ross and Jose Estrada and the WWF as for a second card match. But in Puerto Rico, again, they modernized wrestling, and you can see the influence of the super medics in wrestling in Puerto Rico to this day. That's how good they were. And they have one of the greatest tag team feuds of all time in Puerto Rico against Invader 1 and Invader 3, who came to the island in 84 after working in the WWF, where they were known as Invader 1 and Invader 2. They had great battles over the tag team titles. So sadly, there's not a lot of videos of other matches. I think there's only like two matches of them in video at the moment. Hopefully, people will show up and find some more. But their feud, modernized tag team wrestling, it changed the way tag team wrestling was done in Puerto Rico. And again, almost 40 years later, you see a lot of influence of the Super Medics and Invader 1 and 3 in tag team wrestling in Puerto Rico with the modern tag teams. Tag team that we really not going to talk about because we're going to do a whole podcast of them next week is the Brody and Hansen tag team of 1984 that to this day I remember as the most sadistic tag team that ever visited the island. But we're not going to talk too much about them because we're going to be talking about them next week episode, the Brody and Hansen tag team against Carlos Colon feud that made 1984 incredible in terms of gates, attendance, and money that they made during that year. The Ninja Express, Kendo Nagasaki and Mr. Pogo were one of the most consistent tag teams that we had during the 1980s. They won all the tag team titles. They have feuds against the Young Bloods, against the RPMs, against the Caribbean Express, against the Invaders. They were a very solid tag team. They were not flashy. They were not super dominant, but they were consistent. And they had great feuds with everybody. And they made a lot of money in the island. And they to this day, they still remember. They were under the tutelage of Profe, and during the years, they will add Super Black Ninja, Kensuke Sasaki as part of the Ninja Express, and it worked for them. I mean, they were great, and again, very consistent, not very flashy. They were not, like Bloody and Hansen, or they were not as cheeky and Runstar, but you knew what you could get from them, and they could give you 15, 20-minute matches, solid matches, at any time, at any part of the card. Another tag team that was very, very, I think I would say the most popular foreign tag team, if I'm wrong, please let me know, had to be the Youngbloods. The Youngbloods came to the island, and to this day, they are loved. I mean, they just came a couple years ago for a match, and people were like crazy going over them. That's how popular they were. They really connected with the fans here in the island. They had feuds with everybody. They won every tag team titles. The combination of Mark and Jay, and then Mark and Chris. To this day, I can honestly say they are possibly the most popular foreign tag teams in the history of Puerto Rico wrestling. That's how good they were connecting with the fans and being great baby face. They had the system down, like the Rock and Roll Express and Mid South and Crockett. Well, that's who the Young Blocks were in Puerto Rico. That's how good they were in the island. I know that they were not as successful in the era of the territories, but here in Puerto Rico, again, the most loved, the most popular tag team of that era had to be the Youngbloods. Another tag team that made a lot of money and they were crazy over were the Cheap Herders. Their first run in '81 was really good, but the run in '85, man, that run was unbelievable. They broke Invader 3's arm. They beat the crap out of every tag team during that year. They made a lot of money with Viking was their manager. They had great feuds with everybody, with Carlos Colon and Miguelito Perez, then Carlos Colon and Miguel Perez Padre, then the Invaders, then Invader and Carlos Colon, then again with the Invaders. I mean, Super Medic and Invader 1. I mean, they fought everybody and they made money with everybody in that '85. They have two famous matches in that '85: the barbed wire match and anniversary against Invader One, Invader Three, and their ambulance match against Carlos Colon and Invader One that had like almost 20 something thousand people in Ambison to see that match. And they're both in YouTube. I highly recommend it. Even to this day, people in Puerto Rico, every time they see the Bushwhackers, they're like, F Vince McMahon for doing that to them because they were remembered here as one of the most hardcore, bloodiest tag teams that were ever in the history of Puerto Rico. So to see them as the Bushwhackers really gets to people here in the island when you post anything or they talk about them. But Luke Williams and Butch Miller, every time they come to Puerto Rico, they were made a lot of money, and it really didn't take long for them to be to create heat. They just come in and they just beat somebody up, and then boom, they were over, and they will start all over again. That's how good they were as a tag team here in Puerto Rico. The Caribbean Express, Miguelito Perez and Jose and Huracán Castillo Jr. were one of the most popular tag teams in the late 80s. Uh, as a babyface tag team, they were modernized. Miguelito Perez as a ring technician, Huracán Castillo as a brawler. They had great feuds against the Caribbean Express mostly. I mean, against the Kansas Jayhawks of Bobby Jaggers and Dan Crawford, and maybe we're going to be talking about that feud in a later podcast. But Miguelito Perez and Huracán Castillo, up to their split in 1991, had incredible matches, great feuds against pretty much all the tag teams that came, the Ninja Express, the Baton Twins, and so and so. During this time, that I highly recommend you go out of your way to see some of those matches. And we're going to finish the first part of our look at tag teams with the Baton Twins. They came from the Central States. Right from the beginning, they won the World Tag Team titles from the Ninja Express. To this day, I don't get how they became so popular and so, in the island. They had a great run against the Ninja Express. They turned rule breakers, and they had an even better run against Miguelito Perez and Huracán Castillo and some of the other tag teams. But the Baton Twins, believe it or not, were one of the top drawing tag teams in 1988, 1989, and then they jumped to the AWF. They were popular there. I mean, they made some great money in Puerto Rico. It's one of those things where maybe it didn't connect somewhere else, but it connected in the island. So the Baton Twins, the RPMs, kind of fit that distinction. In later episodes, we're gonna go to the second part. There's many other tag teams like the Hunters, uh, Gustavo Mendoza and Buff Hefferman, the Canguros, and many other tag teams that made Puerto Rico a have better tag team wrestling during the glory years of Capital Sports Promotion. I want to thank everybody who has taken time to listen to the podcast, to share it, to subscribe to the channel here in YouTube. Next week, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Carlos Colon and Abdullah the Butcher feud against Bloody and Handsome. We're going to go from the start all the way to the ending, and hopefully you guys will be here next week. Into then, we want to invite everybody, if you know Spanish, to listen to Desde los Territorios podcast in Spanish. We're celebrating our fourth year, 173 episodes. Also, if you want to know more about it, check out our page here on YouTube. We have many things tonight in the main event, which we look at different cards of the territory era and we say, this is a good match, this is a bad match, you check it out, and so on, and many other things. Into then, I want to thank everybody for taking their time. Thank you for listening to Stories from the Last Territory. Hope you guys enjoy this podcast. And into next week, I always say, sayonara, amigos.